Increased devotion to that cause for which the last full measure of Abraham Lincoln. Can we remember those who have sacrificed their lives to honor its war dead who remain? The United States maintains military cemeteries, 22 of them in 8 countries, forces in World War I, European Theater, and the Pacific Theater of the globe. These shrines of their nature in the world, architecture, and powerful works of art. And among the graves and heroism for the nation.
Statement about our country and how we feel about those who...
You're just taken by graves. You realize the number of young...
I think we should all of anyone who will give their life.
These memorial cemeteries were America's fallen, so intended for the living. For here, the true cost of liberty. In 1914, larger than any before erupted in Europe, the heartland of Western civilization. To World War I in 1917, to its European allies, era of trench warfare, U.S. forces fighting skills and valor. The Great War came to an end. 1,000 Americans lay buried in
Prior to World War I, the Spanish-American War, all those bodies were brought back. The casualties we had, there were families who...
Many Americans were moved by the death of President Theodore Roosevelt. The aviator was shot down behind enemy lines. His family requested he be buried where he fell.
The government did a survey of whether or not to the States, and about 60% of the families and 40% wanted the remains left over.
A permanent resting place for the 30,000. Congress established in 1923. John J. Pershing, commander of U.S. forces Germany. 8 permanent cemeteries and craftsmen in the world were engaged in the 1930s. They became a commitment to peace around the world. During the forces were based throughout the British Isles to protect convoys from the dreaded German U-boats. About 30 miles south of Cemetery. Women buried in these graves died of every make and rank. Some died in France, still more from 1918. There is an ornate chapel that commemorates graves are beneath the sea. They include the entire crew, Tampa. Their vessel and was sunk off the coast of Wales. All 115 hands, also remembered in gold letters, Osmond Ingram, who died to save and was the first American enlisted man killed. Many more would follow. American troops May of 1918. The U.S. 1st Infantry Division counterattacks and took more than 1,000 casualties. Many died from their hospitals in Paris. American Cemetery is located just outside the French. Over 1,500 American Eiffel Tower by both the French and the Americans.
For me, this is a contemplative area where heroic soldiers who died for freedom.
The first Americans to serve in France were Valen Cromwell and her twin sister Dorothy. As hospital workers, they served and witnessed every cruelty of war. Admired by the troops, the strain would prove too much for them. France. They took their own lives. Today, they are rewarded the French Croix de Guerre for their service.
So you see, what this cemetery does is the people who gave their life for our liberty.
U.S. troops were rushed to the aim to halt the Germans' final drive on Paris.
The French troops, after American help, perhaps, the war.
At the town of Chateau-Thierry, troops met and turned back the enemy, a high price for their courage. About 45 miles northeast of Paris. It sits at the foot of a hill where many U.S. Marines fought.
I'm a former Marine, is represented by this place in the Marine Corps.
This dense forest where the Germans were.
They didn't have a chance reconnaissance, and they were thrown basically into... They lost more Marines than they had lost in all of their history. And we need to remember their sacrifice.
French people cannot forget. We were liberated by American.
The capture of Paris. U.S. forces participated in a successful offensive known as the Was. When it ended, thousands in battlefield cemeteries. Was End American Cemetery. The the natural violence that created it, buried alive by earth from exploding shells and mines. The American writer Joyce Kilmer penned The Rouge Bouquet.
There is a new, built by never a spade, covered with earth, 10 meters thick.
6,000 graves. Is that of Sergeant? He was killed on patrol by a German sniper where he now lies.
Fell. Slumber. Let your rifles rest anymore. Joyce Kilmer.
In September 1918, took their first totally independent operation. With 500,000 Americans at arms in their power, the Germans were defeaed. It was a crucial victory for the Allies. 14,000 Americans. At the center of this historic battle, American Cemetery, is a large sundial with a carved American General Pershing's famous quote, "Glory of their deeds."
Who fought and died were sent back 4,153 soldiers.
Included among them is Medal of Honor recipient whose heroism was depicted back home. The nearby town has a special relationship with this cemetery.
Oliver Cunningham died in September. He was struck by a German shell. Very emotionally distraught here in Chilcourt.
Much of the war.
And she donated to rebuild the town hall. And when she died, she was buried in Chilcourt to be by a son.
Church tower are dedicated throughout the day in the field where her son. To the north of Paris, some American Cemetery. Here, American, British, and Australian forces, the heavily reinforced Hindenburg line. Thousands of young doughboys went over the top. And
some of my father's friends are buried. Grave of a corporal, and my father did mention Corporal Sintel's death.
Corporal H.G. Sintel, and was accidentally killed by our first death.
Not all those buried in this serene landscape. Nurse Helen Fairchild gave when her field hospital was attacked. She died. Afterwards, a fellow nurse
can't be as brave as a man.
Is that there are so many unknowns, and it possibly was the only time and I was so struck by those.
The climactic battle of World War I began in 1918. Americans joined in the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive. It lasted 47 days. 6,000 Americans killed. More U.S. dead than any battle in our history. Today, Meuse-Argonne Cemetery in Europe, of more than 14,000 servicemen and women.
The Germans had a big trench, but when the Americans came, they discovered it wasn't
to the furious fighting. 9 medal Corporal Freddie Stowers, Hill 188. Medic attempting to rescue a fallen comrade. The names of the missing are carved on the walls.
Coast until almost Switzerland, you will find one enormous cemetery.
This group of French school children has come for a history.
We have to show the First World War and help them. The children are very moved when they see this doesn't happen again.
It's exactly now the opposite of war. It's calm, it's peaceful. It's about 70,000 few months in north of France to make peace in the world.
During the war to the north of France in Belgium, along with Britain. In the final U.S. division suffered heavy casualties. 90 miles west of Brussels American Cemetery.
The battlefield cemetery for the 91st Infantry Division that were killed on the last day of the war. Names because they were immigrants. Many who
the cemetery takes its name from Fields.
The poppies blow between the crosses that mark our place. The larks, still bravely singing, fly among the guns below.
When the armistice was signed on November 11th, 19, World War I was called to end all wars. There would be an even greater need for American military. 1941, a new threat appeared. With the Japanese attack on America entered the Second World War II, put 16 million. Over a period of more than 400,000 lost their lives, as in World War I. Americans were temporarily every part of the world. Collecting and identifying remains was a difficult one. About 60% of the war dead, but families of over 93,000 permitted their loved ones to remain overseas they died to liberate. 14 World War II cemeteries in 8 different countries. Not forget their sacrifice for freedom. Far off in the Pacific is Manila American Cemetery, the largest of all American overseas, with the graves of more than 17,000. They died in the Pacific theaters of the war from 1941 to
After the war ended over the Pacific, and together in one formal cemetery.
Filipinos who died, 500 buried alongside their American
When the war broke out, the Philippines was part of the United States against Japan.
The President of the United States, the Filipinos into the United States. It was Christmas to move to Bataan.
Resistance. American and Filipino troops and led on the cruel Bataan camps.
When we arrived at, we were about 65,000. 10 dead, 20 dead. We were already at about 400
Many
a day
victims
dying.
of the death march and the camps.
It takes a big sacrifice.
Cemetery's memorial is comprised of a central walkways of 36,200. Two-thirds of all the Americans missing are the 5 Sullivan brothers. USS Juneau was torpedoed off Guadalcanal. All 5 brothers shocked the nation. We stick together for the war effort.
We really learned the lessons of history, and yet we had World War II after that.
At sunset, a carillon played in this tropical land. While war raged in the Pacific, battle century earlier in Europe were back and his fascist allies. Ground operations against Germany and Italy began on at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. In the battle-tested German Africa, 100 Americans died in the desert sand. On the Mediterranean coast of Tunisia is North Africa, America. It is a small, hot climate.
During the war, Tunisia, Nigeria, Liberia, and Iraq
were consolidated here in 1948.
Buried, and 3,720.
I can remember when I helped bury the soul, on how they defended and died for our country.
Visit from the cruise ships that plied the Mediterranean. The headstones, they can find that a gold medalist in the 1936 Draper was on the 400-meter Jesse Owens that embarrassed Hitler's superiority near the Kasserine Pass, and that in World War II, America,
a symbol for the good relation between
the sound of prayer carries out over the field, creating an unforgettable impression. Meanwhile, U.S. bomber squadrons over occupied Europe and Germany runs increased. So did American casualties. Near the famous university town is Cambridge. More than 4,000 Americans buried here were
This is my first visit time that I thought, well, I better come and visit 60 years.
Was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne received in France.
It was very, very emotional. Did you could ever love anybody?
126 names are inscribed. They include that of Alton Glenn Miller, did some of the most popular music of the era. Major Miller was scheduled to perform for the troops in 1944, where over the English Channel, his single-engine planes were never found. Memorial building, a large map depicts the Great Atlantic.
Most of us, we had no fear, and we might not come back. We wouldn't be here.
Following the campaign in North Africa, Sicily, and mainland Italy, the Allies made their historic Lanzio, pinned down for months by the dead before the Allies could break out of there. About 40 miles south of Rome is Sicily-Rome American Cemetery. Resting here are the U.S. servicemen and women. The classically styled memorial is of 3 sets of brothers are buried. The walls of the chapel are carved with the names missing. A sculpted dome that records for posterity the Anzio landings.
I remember one time and we got down the beach and we saw all the skeletons, boots. It was American boots.
Nurses played a critical role at Anzio. 16,000 U.S. casualties